build unshakable self-control. Master your emotions before they control you. You do not lose control in one moment. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the understanding that most people never reach, which is why the loss of control keeps happening without seeming to have a cause that can be addressed. The dramatic moment, the explosion, the impulsive decision, the reaction you regret is not the beginning. It is the end. It is the final, visible expression of a long, invisible sequence of small reactions, small yieldings, small failures of the pause, accumulated across days and weeks into the specific condition in which the dramatic moment becomes not just possible but inevitable. You lose control in small reactions repeated every day. The mildly irritating comment that you engaged with rather than passed through. The minor frustration that you expressed rather than regulated. The small impulse that you acted on rather than examined. Each of these is insignificant in isolation. Each reinforces the neural pattern of the reactive default. Each makes the next reactive response slightly more automatic. And the accumulation of many slightly more automatic reactive responses is the specific condition that produces the dramatic moment, which then appears to be the problem, while the actual mechanism is the invisible daily pattern that produced it. This audiobook is about taking that control back, not through the dramatic decision to become a different person, through the specific, consistent, daily practice of the small interventions, the micro-pauses, the examined impulses, the deliberately chosen responses that interrupt the daily reinforcement of the reactive pattern and begin the daily reinforcement of a different one. Self-control is not a rare quality distributed selectively to the naturally disciplined few. It is a trainable skill, and the reason most people do not have it developed is not that they lack the capacity, it is that the specific training for this specific skill is absent from most people's experience. School teaches many things. Almost nothing in that education is directed at the specific practice of governing the relationship between what you feel and what you do about it. This audiobook provides that training. 10 chapters, each layer building on the previous, each practice more specific than inspiration. By the end, the relationship between your impulses and your behavior will be specifically and substantially different, not because you will have decided to be a more controlled person, but because you will have built the specific internal architecture that makes genuine self-control the natural expression of who you are rather than the effortful exception to who you default to being. When you govern yourself, no one else can govern you. That is the destination. The path begins with the honest examination of where the governing currently resides and why it so often resides somewhere other than with you. Introduction. The architecture of self-command. Self-control is not willpower. This distinction is foundational and must be established before anything else is built on it. Willpower, the direct, forceful suppression of the impulse through the sheer exertion of the deliberate mind, is real, limited, and not the primary mechanism of genuine self-control. It is real because it exists. You can override an impulse through direct effort. It is limited because the resource it draws on, the deliberate processing capacity that the prefrontal cortex provides, is finite and depletable. And it is not the primary mechanism of genuine self-control because genuine self-control does not primarily operate through the overriding of the impulse after it has already developed to the point of requiring force to stop. Genuine self-control operates earlier in the sequence. It operates at the level of the narrative that the impulse develops within. the physiological state that the impulse grows from, the habitual patterns that the impulse is the most recent expression of, and the identity that either endorses the impulse as consistent with who you are or recognizes it as inconsistent with who you are choosing to become. Genuine self-control is not primarily the heroic override, it is the accumulated governance of the conditions in which the override requiring impulse either develops or does not develop. The architecture of self-command is therefore built at multiple levels simultaneously: the physiological, the cognitive, the behavioral, and the identity level, and the training that this audiobook provides addresses each level specifically. The 10 chapters that follow move from the foundational understanding of why self-control is underdeveloped in most people through the specific mechanisms of impulse and trigger, through the pause and the response rewriting practices, through the daily discipline and the emotional surge management, to the long-term identity level development that makes the control genuinely unshakable. Chapter 1 begins with the honest examination of why the control is currently not where it should be, and why that is not a character flaw but a specific training gap. Chapter 1. Why most people lack self-control. Self-control is not rare. It is simply a skill that almost nobody trains. The absence of self-control in most people's behavioral repertoire is not a mystery once the conditions that produce it are understood. The conditions are specific, pervasive, and almost entirely external to the person experiencing the deficit. They are the conditions of the contemporary environment, the specific features of the social, technological, and cultural landscape that were shaped over decades by forces with strong incentives to reduce self-control and essentially no incentives to build it. The instant gratification culture is the most visible of these conditions and the most discussed, but the discussion is rarely precise enough to be actionable. The specific mechanism through which the instant gratification culture erodes self-control is not simply the availability of immediate pleasure. It is the continuous reinforcement of the neural circuit that connects desire to immediate fulfillment, which progressively shortens the tolerance for the interval between the arising of a desire and its satisfaction. The circuit that makes self-control possible is precisely the circuit that allows the desire to exist without immediate fulfillment, the capacity to hold the desire in the system, to experience it without executing on it, and to choose whether and how and when to satisfy it based on considerations that extend beyond the immediacy of the wanting. Every time the desire arises and is immediately satisfied by the notification that is checked the moment the urge to check arrives, by the food that is consumed the moment the craving becomes present, by the emotional expression that is discharged the moment the feeling activates, the neural circuit of the immediate satisfaction is reinforced. The capacity for the interval is not practiced, and the capacity for the interval is the foundation of self-control. The instant gratification culture does not intend to erode self-control. It intends to satisfy desires, and the satisfaction of desires is its business model. But the byproduct of the continuous satisfaction of desires is the progressive atrophy of the capacity to experience the desire without acting on it, the precise capacity that self-control requires. The culture is not malicious. The effect is real. Emotional decision loops are the second major condition that produces the self-control deficit, and they operate through a different mechanism from the instant gratification circuit. The emotional decision loop is the pattern in which the emotional state becomes the primary input to the decision-making process, in which decisions about behavior are made primarily based on what the current emotional state is driving toward rather than on the deliberate assessment of what the situation actually requires and what the person's genuine values and long-term interests are. The emotional decision loop is not the same as making emotionally driven decisions occasionally under the influence of strong activation. It is the habitual pattern in which the emotional state is the primary governance of behavior across most situations. Most of the time, the person in the habitual emotional decision loop is not primarily asking, "What do I actually want to produce here? And what action is most likely to produce it?" They are primarily responding to what does the current emotional state want to do, and how quickly can that be executed. The difference between these two decision processes is the difference between the governed and the ungoverned behavioral pattern, and the governed one is the one that requires the specific training that most people never receive. Why discipline feels unnatural is the third element of the condition understanding, and it is perhaps the most important because it addresses the specific resistance that the development of self-control encounters in the people who most need to develop it. Discipline does not feel natural to most people because discipline requires the consistent experience of the interval, the gap between the desire and the action. The pause between the stimulus and the response, the deliberate choice in the moment where the automatic execution would have been easier. This interval is uncomfortable. The desire is present and pressing. The automatic execution would relieve the discomfort immediately. The discipline requires the maintenance of the discomfort for long enough to choose, which is precisely what the instant gratification culture has been systematically training the person not to do. The unnatural feeling of discipline is therefore not evidence that discipline is not the right path. It is evidence that the person has been conditioned, through the specific training of the instant gratification culture, to experience the interval as uncomfortable, and that the development of self-control requires the systematic relibration of this response, which is precisely what the subsequent chapters of this audiobook build. Self-control is not rare. It is simply a skill that almost nobody trains. The training is available. The path is specific. And the fact that the deficit exists, that the control has been eroded by the conditions described in this chapter, is not a permanent feature of who you are. It is the current state of an architecture that was not built to resist the specific erosion forces it has been exposed to. Building the architecture is the project. The first step is the honest understanding of where the deficit came from, not to excuse it, but to address it with the specific practices that the specific deficit actually requires. Chapter 2: The Hidden Cost of Impulses. The impulse lasts seconds. The consequences last years. The specific cruelty of the impulse as a behavioral mechanism is the radical asymmetry between its temporal profile and the temporal profile of its consequences. The impulse is brief, a flash of activation, a moment of desire, a few seconds of the urgency to act. The consequences of acting on it are long, sometimes hours, sometimes months, sometimes years of navigating the downstream of a decision that was made in a few seconds of activation without the deliberate assessment that the consequences warranted. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is the specific feature of the impulsive behavioral pattern that makes the change from it so difficult. The cost and the benefit arrive on entirely different time scales. The benefit, the satisfaction, the relief, the discharge of the discomfort that the impulse was pressing toward resolving arrives immediately. The cost arrives later, in conditions that feel disconnected from the original impulse, in amounts that were not legible from the moment of the impulse, in forms that require significant effort to trace back to the original decision. The immediacy of the benefit and the delay of the cost are the specific features that make the impulsive pattern reinforced rather than extinguished by experience. The short-term versus long-term thinking distinction is not primarily a thinking style difference. It is a time frame difference in the consequence evaluation that the decision process conducts. The impulsive decision process is evaluating consequences primarily across the next few seconds or minutes. What does this produce immediately? The deliberate decision process evaluates consequences across a much longer time horizon. What does this produce across the next days, months, years? The same decision looks entirely different from these two evaluation frames, and the frame from which the evaluation is conducted determines the conclusion. The person who acted on the impulse and sent the message they later regretted was evaluating the decision from the immediate frame, the urgency to express, the satisfaction of discharge, the momentary relief of having said the thing. The person who chose not to act on the impulse was evaluating from the longer frame, the relationship consequence, the professional consequence, the reputational consequence that the message would produce in the hours and days that followed. Both people were evaluating consequences. They were using entirely different time frames to do it. The specific training that transforms the impulsive evaluation frame into the deliberate one is the consistent practice of the extended time horizon, the deliberate question, before any significant impulse-driven action, of what this produces not in the next few seconds but in the next few days, months, or years. This question does not eliminate the impulse. It does not make the immediate satisfaction less immediately appealing. What it does is add the longer frame information to the decision process that the impulse is conducting in the absence of that information. Regret patterns are the accumulated evidence of the time frame asymmetry, the specific emotional state that emerges when the long frame consequences of the short frame decision have arrived. The regret is the experience of the cost whose size was not legible at the moment of the impulse. It is the feeling of standing in the long frame consequences and looking back at the short frame decision that produced them, with the full information of the consequences that the decision moment did not provide. The study of personal regret patterns, the honest retrospective examination of which types of impulsive decisions have produced the most costly regret, is one of the most direct and most immediately actionable forms of the extended time frame information. The patterns of past regret are the evidence base for the future costs of the current impulse types. The person who has consistently regretted the impulsive communication, the impulsive financial decision, the impulsive relational commitment or withdrawal has specific evidence from their own experience of what those impulse types produce in the long frame. The impulsive identity is the specific and most significant long-term cost of the habitual impulsive pattern, the gradual constitution of the self-concept as someone who does not govern their own behavior, as someone whose actions are primarily determined by the current activation state rather than by their own deliberate choices. This identity is built through the same mechanism as all identities, through the accumulated evidence of many instances of specific behavior. The many instances of impulsive action, accumulated across time, constitute the evidence from which the identity of the impulsive person is assembled by the person themselves and by the people around them. The impulsive identity is self-referring. The person who has come to see themselves as someone who acts on impulse experiences the impulse as consistent with who they are, which reduces the activation of the deliberate override mechanism that might interrupt the pattern. The impulse feels like self-expression. The deliberate override feels like self-suppression. The identity that makes the impulsive pattern feel natural has made the change from it feel unnatural, which is the specific challenge that Chapter 5's identity level work addresses. The impulse lasts seconds, the consequences last years, and the accumulated weight of the consequences, the regret, the relationship costs, the professional costs, the gradual constitution of the impulsive identity is the hidden cost that the immediacy of the impulse makes invisible at the moment of decision. Making it visible deliberately, consistently, as a practice is the specific cognitive discipline that begins the change from the short-frame evaluation to the long-frame one that genuine self-control requires. Chapter 3. Emotional Triggers. You do not lose control randomly. You are activated. The understanding of emotional triggers is the understanding that the reactive behavior is not random noise in the system, it is the patterned output of a patterned input. The specific inputs that reliably produce specific emotional activations in you, followed by the specific behavioral outputs of the reactive default, or your triggers. They are not random, they are consistent. They follow the specific logic of your history, your sensitivities, your core concerns, and the accumulated pattern library of your emotional system. This consistency is the good news, though it does not initially feel like it. The good news is that the patterned output of a patterned input is predictable, and the predictable is mappable, and the mapped is manageable. The trigger that you have identified, that you know will produce the specific activation, can be prepared for in ways that the random and the unpredictable cannot. The trigger that you do not know, the one that surprises you, catches you unprepared. The trigger that you have mapped and anticipated can be met with the pre-established pause rather than the automatic reactive output. Social triggers are the category of triggers that arise from interpersonal interactions, from what others say, do, imply, or fail to do in the context of your relationships and social environments. The social trigger is frequently the most immediately activating because the social environment is the domain in which the core concerns the sense of worth, the sense of belonging, the sense of being respected and valued are most directly at stake and most continuously being updated by incoming social information. The most common social triggers fall into recognizable categories that most people can identify in their own patterns with honest reflection. The dismissal trigger, the response that communicates that your contribution was not valued, your presence was not noticed, or your position was not considered worth engaging with. The disrespect trigger, the behavior that communicates that the person does not regard you with the level of consideration that the relationship or the context warrants. The unfairness trigger, the situation that communicates that you are receiving treatment that does not reflect the equity of your contribution or your standing. And the boundary violation trigger, the action that crosses a line you have established, implicitly or explicitly, about what is acceptable in the relationship or context. Each of these social trigger categories activates a specific emotional response. The dismissal triggers the wounded withdrawal or the defensive assertion. The disrespect triggers the angry confrontation or the cold withdrawal. The unfairness triggers the righteous protest or the resentful compliance. The boundary violation triggers the protective aggression or the anxious appeasement. The specific emotional response and its specific behavioral expression are the individual's signature response to the trigger category, consistent enough across instances to be recognizable as a pattern, if the pattern is examined rather than rationalized. Internal triggers are the category of triggers that arise not from the external social environment but from the internal states that certain conditions produce. The discomfort trigger, the specific discomfort, physical, emotional, or existential, that activates the impulse to relieve it through whatever means produce the fastest relief, regardless of whether those means serve the longer-term interests. The uncertainty trigger, the state of not knowing the outcome, the status, the direction, that activates the impulse to resolve the uncertainty through premature commitment to a specific interpretation or a specific action. The inadequacy trigger, the internal experience of not being enough, of not knowing enough, not being skilled enough, not having produced enough, that activates the impulse to either defend against the experience or escape from it. Internal triggers are frequently more difficult to map than social triggers because they do not have an obvious external cause. The experience appears to arise internally without a specific precipitating event. But the honest examination of the conditions that reliably precede the internal trigger reveals the pattern. Certain levels of fatigue, certain types of cognitive demands, certain relational dynamics, certain environmental conditions reliably produce the internal states that activate the specific behavioral responses. These are the conditions that constitute the internal trigger. Pattern recognition is the specific practice that makes the trigger map available as an operational tool rather than an interesting retrospective description. The pattern recognition practice begins with the retrospective examination described in Chapter 2, the honest review of past reactive instances to identify the input types that reliably produce the reactive outputs. The inputs once categorized, or the trigger map. The trigger map, once available, is the specific tool for the anticipatory preparation that is far more effective than the in-the-moment override of the fully activated reactive pattern. The anticipatory preparation is simple in structure and requires only the consistent application of the recognition. When you are entering a situation or a state that the trigger map identifies as reliably producing a specific reactive pattern before the trigger has fired, before the activation has begun, you set the intention. Not the vague intention to behave better, the specific intention to apply the pause when the activation begins. The intention set before the trigger fires is significantly more available in the moment of the trigger than the intention formed after the activation has already begun to compress the deliberate processing that the intention requires. You do not lose control randomly. You are activated by specific inputs, through specific mechanisms, producing specific patterns of reactive output that are entirely predictable once the map is built. The building of the map is the beginning of the governance, the first step from being governed by the pattern to governing it. The map is built through honest retrospective examination. The governance begins with the anticipatory preparation that the map makes possible. And the Chapter 4 practice turns that preparation into the specific in-the-moment tool that makes the governance real rather than merely intended. Chapter 4. The pause that changes everything. Between the stimulus and your response lies your power. The pause is the physical instantiation of self-control, the moment in which the governance that self-control requires actually occurs. Not the intention to be more controlled, not the general commitment to behave differently, not the understanding of the mechanism, the actual interval created deliberately between the stimulus and the response, in which the deliberate mind occupies the space that the reactive default would otherwise fill without consultation. The concept of the pause in the context of self-control and emotional discipline is not new. It has appeared in multiple earlier audiobooks of this series and is introduced here specifically in the context of impulse management and self-control, where its mechanism operates with particular clarity. The stimulus-response sequence without the pause is the impulse, the desire, the activation, the action, all in rapid succession without the deliberate intervention that constitutes the choice. The stimulus-response sequence with the pause is the governed behavior, the desire, the activation, the pause, the deliberate assessment, the chosen action, in which the action is the product of the deliberate mind rather than the automatic output of the activation state. The myropause is the most important and least dramatic form of the pause practice. It is not the extended retreat from a difficult situation or the formal timeout that is taken before a major decision. It is the 2-second breath before the reply to the provocative message, the brief physical pause before reaching for the phone to send the regrettable text, the momentary stillness before the eating impulse is acted on, the tiny gap between the angry feeling and the first word of the angry response. These myropauses are tiny in duration and enormous in consequence because the consequence of the pause is the difference between the governed behavior and the ungoverned one. The myropause is more practicable than the extended pause in the high activation situations where the impulse is strongest, because it requires only the briefest interruption of the automatic sequence. The fully activated person who is pressed to respond immediately may genuinely not be able to produce the extended pause that the situation would ideally warrant. The social pressure, the urgency of the activation, and the compressed deliberate processing of the high activation state all work against the extended pause. The 2-second myropause, however, is almost always available. It requires only the briefest activation of the regulatory system before the reactive output is generated. The slowing of reactions is the deliberate, practice-based extension of the myropause into the longer interval that the most significant impulse-driven decisions require. Not the panic-button pause of the moment when the reactive output is already in motion, but the systematic cultivation of a slower default response rate, the building of the habit of not responding immediately, across the full range of situations from the trivial to the significant. Building the slowed reaction habit requires the consistent practice of the myropause in the low-stakes situations of ordinary daily life. The email that feels urgent but is not the deliberate 2-minute wait before opening it. Then the further deliberate interval before replying. The social media notification, the deliberate non-immediate check. The choice of when to attend to it rather than the automatic response to the notification trigger. The conversational prompt in a low-stakes social exchange, the deliberate beat before the reply. The moment of the reception of the question before the generation of the answer. Each of these ordinary practice sessions is building the neural infrastructure of the slowed reaction habit, not the single dramatic commitment to pause before important decisions. That commitment is almost impossible to honor when the important decision arrives in a high activation state without the built infrastructure. The many ordinary practice sessions that build the infrastructure that makes the pause available automatically, even in the high activation conditions where the reactive pressure is strongest. The conscious interruption is the most explicit form of the pause practice, the deliberate, named recognition that the reactive sequence has begun and the conscious deployment of the interrupt before the output is produced. The conscious interruption requires the self-monitoring awareness that was introduced in the trigger mapping practice of Chapter 3, the recognition, in the moment of the activation, that this is the activation that the trigger has fired, that the reactive sequence is in motion, and that the pause is available if it is deployed now. The conscious interruption in the moment of the trigger is the operational application of the trigger map in real time. I know this trigger. I know what this activation produces, and I am choosing to interrupt the sequence before the automatic output is generated. The naming of the trigger in the moment of the trigger reduces its power over the subsequent behavior. The unnamed, unrecognized trigger catches you. The named, recognized trigger gives you the specific choice that recognition provides. Between the stimulus and your response lies your power. The pause is where the power lies, not in the refusal to feel the activation. The activation is real and will continue to arrive regardless of the quality of the self-control that governs the response to it. In the maintained interval between the feeling and the behavior, in the deliberate occupation of that interval by the governed mind, and in the choice that the governed mind makes from the fuller picture that the pause provides. That choice is the self-control. The pause is how it happens. The pause is built in the ordinary moments of ordinary days. The building is the practice. The practice produces the architecture that makes the pause automatic. And the automatic pause, the one that is available without deliberate effort in the high activation situations where deliberate effort is most scarce, is the expression of the genuinely developed self-control that this audiobook is building toward. Chapter 5. Rewiring your responses. You are not required to respond the way you did yesterday. The reactive response is not fixed. This statement is the foundation of this entire chapter and requires the complete conviction that it is true because the experience of the reactive pattern, from inside it, frequently suggests the opposite. The anger that reliably arises in the specific type of situation. The anxiety that consistently emerges in the specific type of social condition. The impulsive behavior that recurs in the specific type of activating context. From inside these patterns, the experience is of inevitability, as if the reactive response were the natural and necessary result of the triggering condition, rather than the most recently reinforced of many possible responses. The inevitability is an illusion produced by the automaticity of the habitual pattern. The response that has been practiced many times across many instances of the triggering condition has been built into neural infrastructure that executes reliably and rapidly in the presence of the trigger. This reliability and rapidity feel like inevitability. They are not. They are the features of a well-established habit and habits, however well-established or changeable through the specific process of the rewiring practices described in this chapter. Habit loops are the specific neurological structures through which the reactive response maintains itself and through which the rewiring must occur. The habit loop has three components: the cue, which is the trigger or the condition that initiates the loop; the routine, which is the behavioral response, the reactive action that the cue initiates; and the reward, which is the consequence that reinforces the loop, the immediate satisfaction, the relief, the discharge of the activation that the reactive routine produces. The loop is maintained because the routine reliably produces the reward in response to the cue, reinforcing the neural pathway that connects them. Rewiring the habit loop requires the specific intervention at the routine level, the replacement of the existing reactive routine with a different routine that produces a sufficiently similar reward that the loop is maintained with the new routine rather than the old one. This is not the suppression of the reward is the relief or the satisfaction that the cue is driving toward, and it is a genuine need that the habit is serving. It is the replacement of the specific routine that is serving the need with a different routine that serves the same need without the negative consequences that the original routine produces. The anger that produces the explosive verbal expression is serving the need to communicate the violation, to assert the boundary, to relieve the physiological activation that the anger is generating. The explosive verbal expression is the routine that serves these needs, but it does so at a cost that includes the relationship damage, the professional reputation cost, and the reinforcement of the reactive identity that the preceding chapters have described. A different routine, the deliberate, regulated articulation of the violation and the boundary, produced after the pause practice has reduced the activation level, serves the same needs at a lower cost. The rewiring replaces the high-cost routine with the lower-cost one while maintaining the need satisfaction that makes the loop sustainable. Replacing reactions requires the specific sequencing of the replacement practice that makes it achievable in the conditions where it is most difficult. The sequence begins with the mapping, the identification of the specific loop. What is the cue? What is the routine? What is the reward? The mapping makes the loop visible rather than automatic, which is the prerequisite for the replacement. The invisible habit is practiced automatically. The visible habit is available to be practiced deliberately with a different routine. The second stage of the replacement is the design of the alternative routine, the specific, concrete alternative to the reactive response that serves the same need. Not the vague intention to respond differently, but the specific behavioral plan when this cue occurs. I will do this specific alternative thing. The specificity is essential because the activation state reduces the deliberate processing available for the in-the-moment construction of the alternative. The alternative must be pre-designed in the calm state and available as a specific plan rather than requiring the creative construction of a new response in the moment of the trigger. The third stage is the practice, the consistent deployment of the alternative routine in the presence of the cue, across enough repetitions that the alternative routine begins to build its own neural infrastructure. The initial repetitions will be effortful. The existing pathway is well established and the new pathway is not yet reinforced. The early instances of the alternative routine require the deliberate override of the automatic pull toward the existing pathway. Each successful deployment of the alternative routine is a reinforcement of the new pathway. Each reinforcement makes the next deployment slightly less effortful. The trajectory is from effortful exception to natural default, across many repetitions over time. Building new patterns is the extended time frame version of the replacement practice, the recognition that the rewiring of a well-established habit loop is not the work of a week but of months, and that the development of the new pattern requires the same consistent, progressive, repetition-based building that all neural infrastructure requires. The person who rewires a single reactive pattern through the consistent practice of the replacement routine across 3 to 6 months has changed something real and lasting, not the intellectual understanding of a better response, but the neural infrastructure of a different automatic default. You are not required to respond the way you did yesterday. The requirement of the yesterday response is the automaticity of the established habit loop, which feels like inevitability but is actually the expression of a specific neural infrastructure that was built through practice and can be rebuilt through different practice. The rewiring is not fast, not easy, and not achieved through commitment alone. It is achieved through the specific, sequential, consistent practice of the replacement routine across the full duration that genuine neural restructuring requires. The duration is the discipline. The discipline produces the change. Chapter 6. Discipline in Daily Life. Self-control is built in the small things. The small decisions are where self-control is either built or eroded, and the specific mechanism through which this occurs is the same neural infrastructure reinforcement mechanism that Chapter 5 described in the context of habit loop rewiring. Every decision, regardless of its immediate significance, is a practice session. The decision that executes the governed behavior is a practice session for the governed default. The decision that executes the ungoverned reactive behavior is a practice session for the reactive default. The practice sessions accumulate into the default. The default is the self-control or the lack of it. The importance of the small decisions is therefore not about the decisions themselves. The individual small decision to have the extra portion or to check the phone again or to send the slightly reactive message is not the problem. The accumulated pattern of many small decisions in the direction of the reactive or ungoverned default is the problem. Because that accumulation is the daily reinforcement of the reactive infrastructure that the dramatic loss of control eventually expresses. The small decision practice begins with the identification of the daily decision categories where the governed and the ungoverned options are most frequently available and where the choice between them is most reliably made on autopilot without the deliberate assessment that would recognize the decision as a practice session. These categories are typically in the domains of attention management, what you attend to and when. Physical appetite management, food, substance, comfort seeking, communication management, what you send, post, or say in the moment of activation, and time management, how you allocate the available time across the competing demands. In each of these categories, the ungoverned default is immediately available and immediately satisfying. The attention goes to the notification that has just arrived, rather than remaining on the task at hand. The physical appetite is satisfied at the moment of craving rather than evaluated against the longer-term intention. The communication impulse is expressed at the moment of activation rather than delayed through the pause. The time is allocated to the immediately appealing rather than the genuinely important. Each of these is a small ungoverned decision. Each is a small practice session for the ungoverned default. The governed alternative in each category is the small practice session for the self-control architecture. The notification that is not immediately attended to. The craving that is acknowledged and held for the deliberate assessment of whether satisfying it serves the longer-term intention. The communication that is drafted and reviewed before sending rather than sent in the moment of the impulse. The time that is allocated to the priority task rather than the immediately appealing alternative. Each of these is a small governed decision. Each is a small practice session for the self-control architecture. Consistency is the dimension of the small decision practice that has the most significant long-term effect and that is most difficult to sustain. The consistency requirement is not perfectionism. The goal is not the zero-error execution of every small decision in the governed direction. The goal is the consistent direction of the majority of small decisions toward the governed alternative over a sufficient time period that the neural infrastructure of the governed default is meaningfully strengthened relative to the reactive default. The consistency requirement is difficult because the small decisions are continuous. They are not concentrated in specific identifiable moments, but distributed across the full texture of the day. The discipline of the small decisions requires the maintained awareness across this continuous distribution, which is cognitively demanding and is depleted by the same resource consumption that makes late-in-the-day self-control more difficult than early-in-the-day self-control. Managing the consistency therefore requires not only the practice of the individual governed decisions, but the management of the resource that makes the governance possible, the adequate rest, the structured decision environment, the reduction of unnecessary decision demands that preserve the resource for the decisions that matter. The identity shift is the dimension of the small decision practice that is most significant for the long-term sustainability of the self-control development. The person who is governed by the self-control aspiration, who wants to be more disciplined, who intends to make better decisions, who feels guilty when the ungoverned option is chosen, is using the external aspiration as the governance mechanism. This is both weaker and more exhausting than the governance mechanism that the identity shift provides. The identity shift from aspiration-governed to identity-governed self-control occurs when the consistent practice of the governed decisions across many instances has accumulated enough evidence that the person begins to understand themselves as someone who makes governed decisions, not as an aspiration but as an accurate description. The governed decision is then consistent with who they are rather than the effortful exception to who they default to being. The identity-consistent governed decision requires less regulatory resource than the aspiration-governed one, because the motivation is internal rather than external, and the self-concept is aligned with the behavior rather than intention with it. Self-control is built in the small things. The small things are the daily opportunities that the ordinary texture of life provides for the consistent practice of the governed decision. Each practice session is tiny. The architecture that many practice sessions build is not. The daily accumulation is the only path to the genuine self-control that this audiobook is building toward, and the daily accumulation begins with the next small decision, which is a practice session regardless of whether it is recognized as one. Chapter 7. Controlling Emotional Surges. Emotion is not the enemy, the loss of control is. The distinction in the hook is precise and essential. The development of self-control is not the development of emotional suppression. The two are frequently conflated in both the cultural narrative of self-control and in the experience of people who are attempting to build the sense that controlling your emotions means not feeling them, that the strong person is the unexpressive person, that the goal of the discipline is the flat effect of the thoroughly governed life. This conflation is wrong, and its wrongness is practically important. The suppression of emotional experience, the active, effortful prevention of the feeling itself, is both neurologically counterproductive and behaviorally brittle. Counterproductive because the suppression of emotional experience consumes significant regulatory resource and tends to produce the accumulation of the suppressed material in forms that emerge later with greater intensity. Brittle because the suppression that holds in comfortable conditions fails under sufficient pressure, releasing the accumulated material in an uncontrolled discharge that is typically more severe than the original managed expression would have been. The genuine development of self-control in the emotional domain is the development of the capacity to fully experience the emotional state while governing what it produces as behavioral output. The full feeling and the governed behavior are not incompatible. They are the specific combination that characterizes the genuine self-control rather than the suppression-based performance of it. The person who is fully feeling the anger and choosing the regulated articulation of the specific grievance is demonstrating more genuine self-control than the person who is suppressing the anger and performing the unexpressive exterior. Anger is the emotional surge that most people most need to develop specific governance for, because it is the most immediately activating and the most reliably productive of the behavioral outputs that carry the most significant short-term and long-term costs. Anger is also one of the most information-rich emotional states available. It is consistently and reliably signaling that something of genuine importance has been violated, that a standard has not been met, that a boundary has been crossed, that an expectation of fairness or respect has been failed. This information is valuable and should not be suppressed. What should be governed is the behavioral response to the information. The anger management practice begins with the physiological intervention before any communication or action from the angry state. The deliberate engagement of the physiological regulation practices. The breath regulation that reduces the heart rate and the cortisol flooding the working memory. The deliberate physical slowing that changes the body's urgency signals. The brief, deliberate pause that creates the interval between the feeling and the behavioral output. These physiological interventions do not eliminate the anger. They reduce the activation level from the peak that overwhelms the deliberate processing to the level at which the deliberate processing is partially restored and the governed expression becomes possible. Anxiety is the second major emotional surge category, and it presents a somewhat different governance challenge from anger. Anger is typically a response to a specific, identifiable trigger: the violation, the disrespect, the unfairness. Anxiety is more frequently a response to uncertainty, to the unresolved, the unknown, the situation whose outcome is not yet determined and whose trajectory is not yet clear. The governance of anxiety requires the specific management of the relationship to uncertainty rather than the management of a response to a specific stimulus. The anxiety management practice has two components that work in sequence. The first is the accurate assessment of the uncertainty. What specifically is unknown? What specifically is the range of likely outcomes? And what specifically can be influenced versus what must be accepted as outside the scope of influence? This assessment does not resolve the uncertainty. The uncertainty is genuine and cannot be resolved by the assessment. What it does is contain the uncertainty to its actual proportions, which are almost always smaller than the activated anxiety is representing them as. The second component is the forward orientation, the deliberate direction of the cognitive and behavioral energy toward the specific actions that are within the scope of influence, rather than toward the elaboration of the uncontrollable elements that the anxiety is naturally focused on. The anxiety is produced partly by the genuine uncertainty and partly by the sustained attention on the uncontrollable, the continued mental elaboration of the worst-case outcomes that cannot be prevented. Redirecting the attention from the uncontrollable to the controllable is not the denial of the genuine uncertainty. It is the governance of the attention that the anxiety is consuming in the direction that is genuinely useful rather than the direction that amplifies the anxiety without producing the action that would address what can be addressed. Stress is the third major emotional surge category, the sustained, diffuse activation produced by the continuous demands that exceed the available resources. The governance of stress is primarily the governance of the resource management and the recovery practice described in Chapter 6 of the Mental Strength Audiobook, the systematic management of the ratio between demand and resource, with specific investment in the genuine recovery that rebuilds the depleted resource rather than the activities that feel like recovery but maintain the depletion. Emotion is not the enemy, the loss of control is. The specific practice of the self-control that this chapter describes is the governance of the behavioral output of each of these emotional states, the maintained capacity to feel fully while choosing deliberately. The development of this capacity, through the consistent application of the practices described, is the specific training that transforms the emotional surge from a force that governs the person into information that the person governs. The goal is not the quiet life of suppressed feeling. The goal is the full life of full feeling. Governed by the deliberate mind, the feeling is the signal. The self-control is the governance of what the signal produces as behavioral response. Both are necessary, neither replaces the other. The development of self-control is the development of the relationship between the two, the specific, practiced, progressively more reliable governance of what the emotional information becomes as behavior in the world. Chapter 8. Thinking before acting. Intelligence begins where reaction ends. The capacity to think before acting is not a passive quality, it is the specific, active deployment of the deliberate cognitive system in the space that the pause practice creates. The pause is the interval. The thinking is what occupies the interval, and the quality of the thinking that occupies the interval determines the quality of the action that the interval produces. This is the chapter in which the self-control practices developed in the preceding chapters are connected to the strategic thinking capacities that several other audiobooks in this series have addressed. The consequence chain, the 3MOVE framework, the recognition of the gap between the immediate situation and the structural conditions it is part of. These strategic thinking tools are not available in the reactive state. The reactive state does not think before acting, which is definitionally the state in which the strategic thinking tools are inaccessible. They are available in the pause in the interval created by the self-control practices, and their availability in the pause is one of the most specific and most practically significant returns on the investment in building the pause architecture. Rational filters are the specific cognitive checkpoints that the deliberate mind applies in the pause before the decision is produced. Not the elaborate multi-step analysis that an extended deliberation period would allow, but the brief, specific set of questions that the practiced pause makes available and that consistently improve the quality of the decision relative to the impulsive default. The first rational filter is the time frame extension, not what does this produce in the next 5 minutes. But what does this produce in the next 5 months? This extension was introduced in Chapter 2 as the specific cognitive correction for the impulsive time frame compression, and it is applied here as the first filter in the thinking before cading practice. The extension does not require the precise prediction of long-term outcomes. It requires only the brief, honest consideration of the types of consequences that the proposed action typically produces in the longer frame. The second rational filter is the alternatives question. Is this the only available response? Or are there other responses that the activation state is not naturally generating? The impulse presents itself as the necessary response, as if the current activation and the proposed action were the only options. The rational filter exposes this as an artifact of the activation state's narrowed option set. There are almost always other options. The pause is where they become visible. The third rational filter is the values alignment check. Is this response consistent with the person I am choosing to become? Not in the abstract sense of the aspiration to be a controlled person, but in the specific sense of the concrete behavioral standards that the identity-building practice of Chapter 6 has been establishing. The values alignment check is the identity governance mechanism in real time. It applies the developing self-inept as the evaluative standard for the proposed action, which is more durable and more internally motivating than the external aspiration or the abstract principle. Decision frameworks are the more structured versions of the rational filter practice, designed for the decisions that are significant enough to warrant the additional deliberate investment. The most practically useful decision framework in the self-control context is the premortem, the deliberate imaginative construction of the future in which the impulsive decision was taken and its specific negative consequences have materialized. Not the vague worry about what might go wrong, but the specific, detailed, emotionally vivid construction of the specific regret, the specific damage to the relationship, the specific professional consequence, the specific self-assessment of having failed to govern the behavior in the moment when it mattered. The premortem works by making the long frame cost vivid rather than abstract, by bringing the future consequence into the emotional present in a way that creates the motivational force to make the governed decision now. The impulse is vivid and present. The premortem makes the consequence equally vivid and present. The decision that would otherwise be made from the asymmetry of the vivid immediate gain and the abstract future cost is made from the more symmetrical position of the vivid gain and the equally vivid cost. The symmetry consistently produces better decisions. Mental clarity is the condition that the thinking before cading practice both requires and produces. Requires, because the rational filters and the decision frameworks are only available in the cleared cognitive state that the pause creates, the state in which the activation has been partially regulated and the deliberate processing has been partially restored. Produces, because the consistent practice of the thinking before cading process, across many decisions, builds the cognitive habit of deliberate evaluation that makes the mental clarity progressively more available as the natural operating mode rather than the effortful alternative to the reactive default. Intelligence begins where reaction ends. The intelligence that self-control enables is not a different intelligence from the one that the impulsive person possesses. It is the same intelligence, accessed from the governed state rather than the ungoverned one. The impulsive person is not less intelligent than the deliberate one. They are accessing less of their intelligence because the reactive state has foreclosed the deliberate cognitive processes that the intelligence consists of. The self-control that creates the pause creates the access. the intelligence follows. The relationship between self-control and intelligence is therefore not the relationship between discipline and raw cognitive capacity. It is the relationship between the governance of the inner state and the availability of the full cognitive architecture. The self-control practices of this audiobook are not making you smarter. They are making the full intelligence you already have more consistently available in the conditions where it is most needed and where the reactive state is most specifically designed to prevent its access. Chapter 9. Long-term self-mastery. Self-control is not a moment. It is a way of living. The transition from the self-control practice to the self-mastery identity is the specific transition that this chapter addresses, the shift from the effortful application of the practices to the natural expression of the developed character. This transition is not a single event. It is the gradual, accumulative product of many instances of the practice, across a sufficient time period and across a sufficient range of conditions, that the practices have been built into the neural infrastructure of the person's default behavioral patterns. The distinction between the self-control practice phase and the self-mastery identity phase is the distinction between discipline as effort and discipline as expression. In the practice phase, the governed decision requires the deliberate activation of the regulatory system, the recognition of the trigger, the deployment of the pause, the application of the rational filter, the choice of the alternative routine. This deliberate activation is the effortful quality of the practice phase. In the identity phase, the same governed decision occurs more naturally, not without effort in genuinely difficult conditions, but without the chronic effortfulness of the practice phase, because the practices have become more deeply embedded in the default operating mode. Identity building in the context of self-mastery is the specific process of constructing a self-inept that is accurate rather than aspirational, that reflects the genuine, evidenced qualities of the person's actual behavior rather than the idealized version of who they intend to become. The identity that makes self-mastery sustainable is not built from the aspiration "I want to be a disciplined person." It is built from the accumulated evidence "I am the person who did the governed thing in that situation, and that one, over many instances." The evidence builds the identity sustains the behavior builds more evidence. This is the virtuous cycle of identity-based self-mastery, and it is the specific contrast with the vicious cycle of aspiration-based self-improvement. The aspiration-based cycle is "I aspire to be disciplined. I fail to be disciplined in the specific instance. I feel guilty about the failure. I re-aspire." The cycle produces the same aspiration repeatedly without building the identity or the neural infrastructure that would make the aspiration progressively more realizable. The identity-based cycle is "I practice the governed decision. I build the evidence. I update the self-inept. I practice the governed decision from the updated self-inept." The cycle builds the thing it is aspiring toward. Long-term discipline is the behavioral expression of the developed identity across the full range of conditions, including the conditions that most test the identity, the conditions where the cost of the governed behavior is highest and the appeal of the ungoverned alternative is greatest. This is the dimension of long-term discipline that most directly determines the genuine strength of the developed self-control, not the governance in comfortable conditions, where the cost is low and the governed behavior is relatively easy, but the governance in the genuinely difficult conditions where the cost is high and the appeal of the ungoverned alternative is at its maximum. The genuinely difficult conditions for self-control are worth identifying explicitly, because they are the conditions that require the most specific preparation and that provide the most diagnostic information about the current strength of the developed identity. Fatigue is the most common. The depleted state reduces the deliberate processing available for the regulatory system, which lowers the effective self-control in proportion to the depletion. The preparation for fatigue conditions is not the attempt to maintain the same level of governance with depleted resources. It is the management of the conditions that produce the depletion and the investment in the genuine recovery that rebuilds the resources. Social pressure is the second major genuinely difficult condition, the situation in which the social environment is pressing toward the ungoverned behavior, in which the immediate social cost of the governed choice is high, and in which the maintenance of the governed behavior requires the specific resistance to the social norm that the self-governance identity provides, but the aspiration-governed person cannot reliably access. The preparation for social pressure is the anticipatory recognition of the pressure as a test of the identity rather than as a reason to revise the behavioral standard. Emotional flooding is the third major genuinely difficult condition, the state of high emotional activation in which the prefrontal regulatory system is partially offline and the reactive default is pressing with maximum force toward the impulsive output. The preparation for emotional flooding is the physiological regulation practices and the pre-committed alternative routines, the specific practices that are available as automatic responses to the flooding trigger rather than requiring the in-the-moment construction of the governed alternative from the partially depleted deliberate processing that the flooding state produces. Internal authority is the quality that long-term self-mastery produces, and that is its most significant output. The person who has built genuine self-mastery, who governs their behavior from the internal standard rather than from the external pressure, from the deliberate assessment rather than from the reactive default, from the developed identity rather than from the aspiration, has achieved the specific form of authority over their own life that cannot be granted by any external source. It is the authority of being the primary determining force in your own behavior. That authority is what this entire audiobook has been building toward. Self-control is not a moment. It is a way of living. The way of living is built from the accumulation of many moments, each practiced, each incrementally building the infrastructure, each contributing to the identity that makes the way of living the natural expression of who you are rather than the effortful override of who you default to being. The way of living begins in each moment that is practiced. It is never completed, and it is built irreversibly one moment at a time. Chapter 10. Becoming Unshakable. When you govern yourself, no one else can govern you. The unshakable quality, the specific condition in which the external pressures, the social provocations, the emotional surges, and the impulsive pulls no longer reliably produce the reactive behavioral outputs they were designed to produce, is the end state that the preceding 9 chapters have been building toward. It is worth naming precisely what the unshakable quality is and is not, because the precision is the specific protection against the misunderstanding that would undermine the development. The unshakable person is not unmoved. They are not immune to the emotional aggravations that difficult conditions produce, not indifferent to the social provocations that are directed at them, not unfazed by the impulsive pulls that the instant gratification culture continuously generates. The unshakable quality is not the absence of being affected, it is the specific, built architecture that governs what the being affected produces as behavioral output. The unshakable person feels the pull fully. What they do not do is execute the pull. Emotional independence is the first dimension of the unshakable quality and has been developed across multiple audiobooks in this series. In the specific context of self-control, emotional independence is the freedom from the specific form of external governance that the reactive pattern provides. The person who reliably reacts to the specific triggers in the specific ways is governed by those triggers. Their behavior is a function of the environmental inputs rather than of their own deliberate choices. The person who has built the self-control architecture is significantly less governed by the environmental inputs. Their behavior is increasingly a function of their own deliberate governance, which is the operational definition of emotional independence. The social dimension of this independence is the specific freedom from the social manipulation that the reactive pattern makes possible. The person whose anger can be reliably triggered by a specific type of input has given the trigger source the specific power to produce angry behavior on demand. The person whose anxiety can be reliably activated by a specific type of uncertainty has given that uncertainty the power to produce anxious behavior. Every reliable trigger is a lever. The development of self-control removes the levers not by eliminating the activation that the trigger produces, but by removing the reliable connection between the trigger and the behavioral output that the trigger was designed to produce. Stability is the second dimension of the unshakable quality, the specific consistency of behavioral quality across the full range of conditions. From the comfortable to the genuinely difficult, the stability is not the flatness of suppressed emotional life. It is the consistency of the governed behavioral output across the variable emotional landscape. The stable person feels the variability, the good days and the difficult ones, the high activation states and the calm ones, the challenging conditions and the supportive ones. What does not vary is the quality of the governed behavior, because the governance is based on the internal standard rather than on the conditions. Personal power is the third dimension of the unshakable quality and the one that encompasses the others. The person who governs their own behavior, whose decisions are made from the deliberate assessment rather than from the reactive default, whose emotional states are felt fully but governed in their behavioral expression, whose impulses are examined before being acted on rather than immediately executed, has achieved the specific form of personal power that no external authority can grant and no external force can remove. This personal power is the power over the self that is the foundation of all other forms of genuine power. The person who cannot govern their own behavior is ultimately governed by whoever or whatever most reliably activates their reactive patterns. The person who governs their own behavior is governed by their own deliberate choices, which is the only governance that constitutes genuine personal authority. When you govern yourself, no one else can govern you. This is the specific transformation that the development of self-control produces, not the dramatic change in external circumstances, not the removal of the difficult people or the challenging conditions, not the arrangement of a life free from provocations and pressures and impulsive pulls. The transformation is internal and identity level, the development of the specific architecture that keeps the governance with you rather than with the environment that is trying to produce your reactive output. The development is never finished. The architecture continues to be built and tested and strengthened and occasionally found wanting in new conditions that require the extension of the practice to new domains. There is no final achievement of the unshakable quality. There is the ongoing direction of becoming it, which is the specific direction that the 10 chapters of this audiobook have been building. The direction is clear. The practices are specific. The architecture is buildable, and the ordinary daily life that this moment is a part of, with its continuous opportunities for the governed decision, the practiced pause, the chosen response, the examined impulse, is the training ground on which the unshakable quality is built, one small decision at a time from this moment forward. The trigger will arrive, the impulse will arise, the reactive pull will be present. The architecture is what determines what happens next. Build the architecture. Build it through the daily practice. Build it through the small decisions. Build it through the consistent application of the pause, the examined impulse, the chosen response. Build it until it is not the effort of the practice but the expression of who you are. Closing. The self you are building. 10 chapters. 1. Developing architecture. Not the architecture of the person who does not feel the pull. The architecture of the person who feels it fully, every trigger, every impulse, every emotional surge with complete internal registration, and whose behavior is governed by the deliberate mind rather than by the automatic execution of the pull. Chapter 1 named the starting point and its cause, the specific environmental conditions, the instant gratification culture, the emotional decision loops, the absent training that have produced the deficit of self-control in most people's behavioral repertoire. The deficit is not a character flaw. It is the specific training gap produced by specific environmental conditions. The gap is closable. The training is available. Chapter 2 made the cost concrete, the radical temporal asymmetry between the impulse that lasts seconds and the consequences that last years. The short frame evaluation that the impulsive pattern conducts and the long frame evaluation that the deliberate pattern requires. The regret patterns as the accumulated evidence of the asymmetry from the past. The impulsive identity has the most significant long-term cost, the gradual constitution of the self-concept as someone whose behavior is primarily determined by the current activation state. Chapter 3 built the trigger map, the identification of the specific patterned inputs that reliably produce the specific patterned reactive outputs. Social triggers and internal triggers, categorized by the core concerns they activate. Pattern recognition is the specific practice that makes the trigger map available as an operational tool. The anticipatory preparation, the intention set before the trigger fires, as the specific use of the trigger map that shifts the self-control from the impossible in the moment override to the possible pre-established pause. Chapter 4 built the pause architecture, the micropause, the slowed reaction, and the conscious interruption as the 3 forms of the interval between the stimulus and the response. The physiological interventions that hold the gap. The neural infrastructure that consistent practice builds into the default, making the pause automatic in the conditions where deliberate effort is most scarce. And the central truth between the stimulus and the response lies the power. The pause is where it lives. Chapter 5 developed the habit loop rewiring practice, the cue routine reward structure of the reactive habit. The design of the alternative routine that serves the same need at lower cost. And the consistent practice of the alternative across sufficient repetitions to build the new neural infrastructure. You are not required to respond the way you did yesterday. The requirement is the automaticity of the established habit loop, not the fixed nature of who you are. Chapter 6 built the daily discipline, the small decision as the practice session, the consistency as the builder of the neural infrastructure, and the identity shift as the specific development that makes the practice sustainable beyond the aspiration-governed phase. Self-control is built in the small things, the daily accumulation of governed decisions that is both the training and the architecture. Chapter 7 addressed the emotional surges, anger, anxiety, and stress as the primary surge categories, each requiring the somewhat different governance practice. The foundational reframe: emotion is not the enemy. The loss of control is. The goal is not the suppressed life of managed unexpressiveness, it is the full emotional life, governed in its behavioral expression, lived from the deliberate mind rather than the reactive default. Chapter 8 connected the self-control practices to the strategic thinking tools of this series, the rational filters, the decision frameworks, and the premortem as the specific cognitive tools that the pause makes accessible. Intelligence begins where reaction ends, not because the impulsive person is less intelligent, but because the reactive state forecloses the deliberate cognitive architecture that intelligence consists of. The self-control that creates the pause creates the access to the full intelligence. Chapter 9 addressed the long-term self-mastery dimension, the transition from the effortful practice phase to the identity expression phase, from the discipline as coveride to the discipline as harder, the identity building through the accumulated evidence of many governed decisions, the virtuous cycle of the identity-based self-improvement, the internal authority that long-term self-mastery produces, the specific form of authority over one's own life that cannot be granted by any external source. And Chapter 10 named the destination the unshakable quality, emotional independence, behavioral stability, and personal power as the three dimensions of the developed self-control. When you govern yourself, no one else can govern you. The triggers that once reliably produced the reactive outputs become less reliable as the architecture strengthens. The levers that once moved you become less available as the self-governance that constitutes unshakability develops. You do not lose control in one moment. You lose it in small reactions repeated every day. And you build it back the same way. The trigger arrives. You feel it. You pause. You think. You choose. Small. Consistent. Every day. Unshakable.